Welcome to another human-read audiobook by the United Marxist Pact Discord server, link below in the description. In this series, we continue our investigation into the initial construction, the organizational structure, the principles and tactics of the form of worker organization capable of seizing political power and establishing the revolutionary proletarian dictatorship and communality, which can in turn produce a communist mode of production through shared class interests of the workers of the entire world. Our goal is to compile, analyze, and elaborate on what all these texts have to say about this. In the end, have a strong understanding of the exact scientific process of it, particularly in general terms. At the end of our readings as a whole, we will try to put it all together and present it as a coherent whole and educational video with associated notations. Today's reading will be in the 1922 Third Communist International Fourth Congress's Communist Party of Italy's report on fascism. This is Bordiga speaking. There's a later one of this in 1924, but this first one is a bit closer to the ground and the development of it. So we have a pre-written textual analysis on the terms of the aforementioned topics, which is also posted in the pinned comment if you want to read it on text, or follow the link in the description to read-only version of my Google Docs notes. This will summarize the contents of the text, but is no replacement for the actual reading itself for the sake of understanding the context. In addition, in the reading I supply my own commentary, critiques, additions, etc., which may be helpful for understanding some particularities. Now, this text isn't specifically really about organizational structure and tactics, but you can find them in here. So in this case, we're going to be, there's a lot more in the actual reading. So please actually listen to that. But for our analysis for these, in this text, in terms of talking about worker organization, Bordiga makes a case that fascism arises from the failure of the Communist Party to bring the various strata of the working class into a unified political struggle, allowing the bourgeoisie to do so instead, while taking parts of the pay bourgeois, military, etc. into a reactionary mass which suppresses all partial interests of the bourgeoisie to support one shared long-term interest, the maintaining of private property. Bordiga advises not to let the proletariat spin their wheels in fruitless defensive economic struggles which demoralize them, or allow cracks to be in place between the agricultural and industrial workers which allows the bourgeoisie to drive the wedge in the communist movement. Beyond that, he discusses the depth of the character of fascism, its relation with liberalism, and anticipates fascism becoming liberalized, while also drawing a line between social democracy and fascism in terms of their goals, activities, and eclectic opportunism. And I will now begin the full audiobook reading. I hope that you enjoy the session and will attend next time as well. Welcome to another United Marxist Pact reading session. Today we will be reading the report on fascism by the Communist Party of Italy's delegate. This is particularly by Bordiga. Now, I believe that I've actually read this in the past, or rather that Socialism for All did a reading of it, and I was less impressed on it. Maybe this was a different one, but I'm not certain. More specifically, this is probably going to talk about how we need to organize to combat fascism. Now, I don't think that's going to work very well, given the utter failure of the Italian left to actually defeat it. But that's not particularly special to them either. So we'll give them a fair shake. So let's get started with the reading. This was in the Third International's Fourth Congress 12th session on November 16th, 1922. The discussion is on report of the capitalist offensive. The speakers are Bordiga, Smiral, Pullman, and Urbans. Kolarov was the chairman, And he states the session is now open. I call on Comrade Bordiga to report on the question of fascism. Bordiga says, Dear comrades, I regret that the present extraordinary conditions of communications between the delegation and the party will not permit me to avail myself of all the documents upon this question. A report was written on the subject by our comrade Togliatti, but I have not had an opportunity of seeing it. It has not yet arrived, and I'll advise the comrades who desire to obtain exact information on the subject to read that report when it arrives. For as soon as it is received, it will be translated and distributed here. However, last night I was able to get additional information, as the special emissary of our party has arrived in Moscow and furnished me with more detailed information on the impressions of our comrades in Italy in connection with the latest fascist events. And with those I will deal with the closing part of my report. I will deal with the question raised by Comrade Radek yesterday as to the attitude of the Communist Party towards fascism. Our comrade criticized the attitude of our party on the question of fascism, which is the dominant political question in Italy. He criticized our alleged point of view, which is supposed to consist of a desire to have a small party and to limit the consideration of all questions solely to the aspect of party organization and their immediate importance, without going any further into the larger questions at issue. I will try to be brief on account of the time limit. With those few remarks, I will start my report. Origin of the fascist movement. As regards the origins of the fascist movement in what we might call the direct and external sense, it can be traced back to 1914 to 15, namely to the period which preceded Italy's intervention in the World War. In fact, its founding groups, which espouse a range of political tendencies, were precisely the ones who supported this intervention. There is a group on the right led by Salandra and the big industrialists, which had vested interests in war, and which, before clamoring for intervention on the side of the Entente, had avidly supported a war against it. Then there were the tendencies of the left-wing bourgeoisie, the Italian radicals, for example, the Democrats of the left and the Republicans, traditionally in favor of liberating Trieste and Trent. And finally, within the interventionist movement, there are certain elements of the proletarian movement too, namely the revolutionary syndicalists and anarchists. And amongst the latter groups we find, a matter of one individual true, but nevertheless a very important one, the leader of the left wing of the Socialist Party and director of Avanti, Mussolini. It may be stated as a rough approximation that the center groups did not participate in the formation of the fascist movement, but kept within the framework of traditional bourgeois politics. Remaining in the Fasci di Combattimento movement were those of the extreme right and those of the extreme left, for example, ex-anarchists, ex-syndicalists, and former revolutionary syndicalists. So I just want to say that a YouTube series by a guy named Bess D. Marx goes over Mussolini's own development quite well. These political groups, which in May 1915 scored a major victory by forcing Italy into the war against the will of the majority of the country and even a parliament, which was unable to resist a soon coup de main, saw their influence decline after the war. Indeed, this has been noticeable even during the conflict itself. They had presented the war as a very easy enterprise, and when the war became prolonged, they lost popularity, which had only ever been minimal in any case. The end of the war, therefore, marked the reduction of their influence to a minimum. Between the end of 1918 and the first half of 1920, which was a period of demobilization and slump, this political tendency was of little consequence due to the general malcontent provoked by the aftermath of the war. Nevertheless, it is easy to establish the political and organic connection between this movement, seemingly so insignificant then, and the formidable movement confronting us today. The Fasci di Combattimento never ceased to exist. Mussolini remained the leader of the fascist movement, and their paper Il Popolo d'Italia continued to be published. Despite their daily newspaper and their political chief being based in Milan, the fascists were completely defeated in Milan in the October 1919 elections. Having obtained a ridiculously low number of votes, they nevertheless continued their activities. After the war, the revolutionary socialist current within the proletariat that had been considerably strengthened by the revolutionary enthusiasm of the masses, but had failed to exploit this favorable situation. It suffered for a further attenuation because all the objective and psychological factors which favored a strengthening of revolutionary organization found no party capable of building on them to create permanent and stable organization. I do not assert, as Comrade Zinoviev has accused me of saying, that the Socialist Party could have brought about the revolution in Italy, but at least it could have provided the revolutionary forces of the working masses with a sound organization. It proved unequal to the task. Hence, even though it was always opposed to the war, we have now seen the popularity of the socialist tendency used to enjoy in Italy drop away. To the extent that the socialist movement failed to take advantage of the social crisis in Italy and committed one error after another, the opposite movement, fascism, started growing. Fascism benefited above all from the looming economic crisis which was starting to exert its influence within the proletariat's trade union organization. In addition, during a particularly difficult period, fascism found its support in the Annunzio expedition to Fiume. It is from the Fiume expedition that fascism derived a certain moral strength, as well as the birth of its organization and its armed forces, even though the D'Annunzio movement and the fascist movement were not identical. I'm assuming that the D'Annunzio movement did some sort of demonstration and it was crushed by the bourgeoisie. And as a result, it gave the excuse for fascism to arm itself, and with the masses not really arguing against it. Continuing, we have spoken on the stance of the proletarian socialist movement. The International has repeatedly criticized its mistakes. The consequence of these mistakes has been a complete change in the mentality of the bourgeoisie and the other classes. The proletariat became disorganized and demoralized. Having seen victory slip through its fingers, it has undergone a complete change of heart. One could say that in 1919 and during the first half of 1920, the Italian bourgeoisie have almost become resigned to the idea of having to see out the triumph of the revolution. The middle class and the pay bourgeois were ready to play a passive role. Not in the wake of the big bourgeoisie, but in the wake of the proletariat, which was on the road to victory. They have now undergone a complete change of heart as well. Instead of submitting to a victory of the proletariat, we see the bourgeoisie organizing to defend itself. The middle class became discontented when it saw the Socialist Party was incapable of organizing in such a way as to gain the upper hand. And having lost confidence in the proletarian movement, it turned to the opposition. It was then that the capitalist offensive of the bourgeoisie started. Basically, it exploited the current state of mind of the middle class. Fascism, by reason of its extremely heterogeneous character, offered a solution to the problem of how to mobilize the bourgeoisie behind the capitalist offensive. The Italian case is a classical example of the capitalist offensive. It represents, as Comrade Radek told us yesterday from this platform, a complex phenomena, which should be considered not only from the standpoint of reduced wages and longer hours, but also from the general standpoint of political and military action of the bourgeoisie against the working class. In Italy, during the period when fascism was evolving, we saw every manifestation of the capitalist offensive. If we want to consider the capitalist offensive in its entirety, we must examine the situation under its various aspects, in the industrial as well as the agrarian field. In the industrial field, the capitalist offensive directly exploits the effects of the economic crisis. The crisis starts, there's unemployment. Some of the workers have to be sacked, and the employers take advantage of the situation by kicking the union leaders and more extreme elements out of the factories. The industrial crisis provided the employers with good pretext for cutting wages and revoking the disciplinary and moral concessions which the factory workers had previously forced them to make. At the beginning of this crisis in Italy, the General Confederation of Industry was formed, an association of the employing class which takes the lead in the fight against the workers and subjects each individual industrial sector to its discipline. In the big cities, you can't launch an offensive against the working class by using violent means from the start. Urban workers generally form a substantial mass. They can easily gather in large numbers and put up serious resistance. There has been a tendency, therefore, to provoke the proletariat into struggles of an essentially trade union character. ones they usually lost due to the economic crisis being in its most acute stage and unemployment still on the up. The only way the economic struggles in the industrial sphere could have led to victorious conclusion was by transferring the activity in the trade union field over to the revolutionary domain, converting it into a dictatorship of a genuinely communist political party. But the Socialist Party was nothing of the sort. At a decisive moment, it proved incapable of giving revolutionary lead to the action of the Italian proletariat. The period of great successes in the Italian trade union organization's fight for the amelioration of the workers' conditions gave place to a new period in which strikes became the defensive strikes on the part of the working class, and defeats became the order of the day. I'll take that. Okay, so the bourgeoisie tries to provoke the working class into fruitless defensive battles and economic struggles. Party needs to transfer activity from the trade unions to the revolutionary domain, aiming at seizure of political power. By not doing such, it makes the working class demoralized. And with a lack of a political class party organization which can do such, the workers find other methods, in this case, fascism. Back to text. Since within the revolutionary movement in Italy, the agrarian classes, mainly the agricultural laborers, but including those strata which are not completely proletarianized, are very important, the ruling classes were compelled to seek a way of combating the influence acquired by the red organizations in the rural districts. Throughout a substantial part of Italy, in particular the most important agricultural districts of the Po Valley, a state of affairs prevailed which closely resembled a local dictatorship of the proletariat, or of groups of agricultural laborers at any rate. The communes, captured by the Socialist Party at the end of 1920, pursued a policy of imposing local taxes on the agrarian bourgeoisie and middle classes. We had flourishing trade unions, important cooperative organizations, and numerous sections of the Socialist Party. And even when the movement was in the hands of reformists, the working class movement in the rural districts adopted a decidedly revolutionary stance. The employers were even forced to deposit sums of money as a kind of guarantee that they would carry out agreements imposed on them by the trade union struggle. Thus, a situation arose in which the agricultural bourgeoisie could no longer live on their estates and had to seek refuge in the cities. But the Italian socialists committed a number of blunders, particularly as regards the matter of the occupation of vacated lands, and the tendency of small tenant farmers, after the war, to acquire land in order to become paid proprietors. The reformist organizations compelled these small farmers to remain, so to speak, the serfs of the agricultural laborers' movements. In such circumstances, the fascist movement found it could draw on significant support. In agriculture, there was no crisis linked to widespread unemployment, such as to allow the landed proprietors on the terrain of basic trade union struggles to wage a successful counteroffensive. It was here, therefore, that the fascists began to introduce their methods of physical violence, of armed brute force, drawing support from the rural proprietor class and exploiting the discontent generated among the agricultural middle classes by the blunders of the Socialist Party and the reformist organizations. Fascism benefited also from the general situation and from a growing malaise and discontent which was spreading throughout all layers of the pay bourgeois, affecting small shopkeepers, pay proprietors, and the disenchanted soldiers and ex-officers who were disappointed in their lot following the glories of war. All these elements were grist to the mill, and once organized into military formations, the movement for the destruction of the red organizations in the rural districts of Italy could get underway. The methods employed by fascism are rather peculiar. Having assembled all these demobilized elements which had failed to find a place for themselves in a post-war society, it made full use of their military experience and started to form military organizations not in big industrial cities, but in those cities which may be considered as the capitals of Italian agricultural regions, such as Bologna and Florence, and would be supported in this end, as we will see, by the state authorities. The fascists possess arms, means of transportation, enjoy immunity of the law, and take advantage of these favorable conditions even when where they are not yet numerous as their revolutionary adversaries. The mode of action for their, quote, punitive expeditions It's somewhat as follows. They invade some small place in the country, destroy the headquarters of the proletarian organizations, force the municipal council to resign at the point of a bayonet, and assault or murder those who oppose them, or at best force them to quit the district. The local workers are powerless to resist such a concentration of armed forces backed by a police. The local fascist groups, which previously didn't dare to take on the proletarian forces, now have the upper hand because the local workers and peasants have been terrorized and are afraid of taking any action for fear for the fascist expedition might return in even greater numbers. Fascism thus proceeds to the conquest of a dominant position in Italian politics in a sort of territorial campaign, the kind which lends itself very well to being traced out on a map. The fascist campaign got underway in Bologna. When the city, in September to October 1922, a socialist administration had been installed, and where there had been a consequent mobilization of the Red Forces. Several incidents took place. The meeting of the municipal council was broken up by external provocation. Shots were fired at the benches occupied by the bourgeois minority, probably by agent provocateurs. These events led to fascists' first big coup de main. From this point, militant reaction spread throughout the country, putting the torch to proletarian clubs and maltreating their leaders. With the full backing of the police and the authorities, they took the city. The terror started at Bologna on the historical date of November 21st, 1920, when the municipal council of Bologna was prevented by violence from assuming its powers. From Bologna, fascism followed a route which we won't outline in detail here. Suffice to say that geographically it went in two directions. On the one hand, towards the industrial triangle of the northwest, vis-a-vis Milan, Turin, and Genoa. On the other, towards Tuscany and the center of Italy, in order to encircle and lay siege to the capital. It was clear from the outset that the south of Italy was no more capable of giving birth to a fascist movement than to a great socialist movement. Fascism is so little movement on the backward part of bourgeoisie that it appeared, first of all, not in southern Italy, but rather in those districts where the proletarian movement was more developed and the class struggle more in evidence. On the basis of these facts, how are we to interpret the fascist movement? Is it a purely agrarian movement? This is not all what we meant when we said that the movement originated in the rural districts. Fascism cannot be considered as an independent movement in a particular part of the bourgeoisie, as the organization of the agrarian interests in opposition to the industrial capitalists. What is more, it was in the cities that fascism formed its political and military organization, even in those provinces where it confined its violent actions to rural districts. We have seen that after its participation in the 1921 elections, the fascists formed a parliamentary group, but this did not prevent an agrarian party from forming independently of the fascists. During successive events, we have seen the industrial employers supporting the fascists. A decisive factor in the new situation has been the latest declaration of the General Confederation of Industry, which pronounced in favor entrusting the formation of a new cabinet to Mussolini. But a more striking phenomenon in this respect is the appearance of fascist syndicalism. As already mentioned, the fascists have taken advantage of the fact that the socialists never had an agrarian policy of its own, and that certain elements in the countryside, those of which are not purely proletarian, have interests opposed to those of the socialists. Fascists, although an armed movement used to employing the most brutal forms of violence, knew how to use such methods alongside the most cynical methods of demagoguery, and to create class organizations among the peasants, and even among the agricultural laborers. In a certain sense, it even opposed the landlords. There are examples of trade union struggles led by fascists in which the methods used to show marked similarities to those employed by red organizations. We cannot consider this fascist syndicalism, which works through use of force and terror, as a form of anti-capitalist struggle. But neither can we, on the other hand, draw the conclusion that fascism is specifically a movement of the agricultural employers. So, to note, the fascists appear more like a gang than anything else because you've got the fascist unions, and they are going and attacking all the unions that aren't fascists, that aren't avowedly a fascist union. In reality, fascism is a great unitary movement of the dominant class, capable of putting at its disposal any and all means and of subjugating every partial and local interest of the various employers in agriculture and in industry in pursuit of its wider goals. The proletariat has not understood properly the necessity of joining together in a single unitary organization in order to take power and the need to sacrifice the immediate interests of this or that particular group in pursuit of this aim. It wasn't able to resolve this problem when the moment was favorable. The Italian bourgeoisie profited from the circumstance by attempting to do the same thing on behalf of its own class. The dominant class constructed an organization which would defend its power, which would be completely under its control, and would therefore follow a unitary plan of capitalist anti-proletarian offensive. Fascism created a trade union organization. Why? In order to take part in the class struggle? Never. The watchword of the trade union movement fascism created may be summed up as follows. All economic interest groups have the right to organize. One can form associations of workers, peasants, businessmen, capitalists, landowners, etc. All can organize on the same principle that trade union activity of all organizations should be subordinate to the national interests, national production, national prestige, etc. This is nothing but class collaboration. It is not class struggle. All interests are directed towards a self-styled national unity. This national unity is nothing more than the counter-revolutionary conservation of the bourgeois state and its institutions. We believe that the genesis of fascism can be attributed to three main factories: the state, the capitalist class, the mill, and the middle class. Foremost amongst those is the state. In Italy, the state apparatus has an important role in the foundation of fascism. Reports about the excessive government crisis in Italy have led to the idea that the Italian capitalist class is in possession of a state apparatus so unstable that a simple coup de main would be enough to overthrow it. This is not the case. The fact that the Italian bourgeoisie was able to form the fascist organization was a measure of just how consolidated its state apparatus was. In the period immediately after the war, the Italian state underwent a crisis whose manifest cause was demobilization. All those who had taken part in the war were suddenly thrown onto the labor market. At this critical point, the state machine, which had previously been organized to its highest pitch to resist a foreign enemy, had to suddenly transform itself into an apparatus to defend capitalist interests against internal revolution. It was a huge problem for the bourgeoisie, a problem which could be resolved neither in a technical or military manner, but had to be resolved by political means. We see the birth of the radical governments of the post-war period, the rise to power of Nitti and Giolotti. So I just want to say this is not the text that Socialism for All read. I can say that with absolute certainty at this point. It was actually the policies of these two politicians which made the subsequent victory of fascism inevitable. First of all, it was necessary to make concessions to the working class, precisely at the moment the state mechanism needed to be consolidated. Fascism appeared on the scene. It was pure demagoguery when the latter accused the post-war government of backing down to revolutionaries. As a matter of fact, the fascist victory was possible precisely because of the first post-war ministries. Nitti and Giolitti made a few concessions to the working class. Certain demands of the Socialist Party, demobilization, a democratic regime, and amnesty for deserters, were acceded to. These various concessions were made in order to gain time to reestablish the state apparatus on a solid footing. It was Nitti who founded the Guardia Regia, the Royal Guard, an organization not so much of the police, but rather of a new military type. One of the biggest mistakes made by the reformers was not considering this fundamental question. This is a fundamental question. Even though it could have been dealt with a purely constitutional issue, as a protest against the fact that the state was forming a second army. The socialists failed to grasp this point, seeing Nitti a man they might well collaborate within a left government. This is yet more evidence of this party's incapacity to see the way Italian politics was going. Giolitti completed the work Nitti started. It was a member of Giolitti's cabinet, Bonomi, the Minister of War, who fostered the beginnings of fascism by placing demobilized officers at the disposal of the nascent movement. Officers who although they had re-entered civilian life, were still in receipt of a large part of their army's salaries. The state machine was placed at the disposal of the fascisti in as large a measure as possible, furnished all necessary material for the creation of an army. At the time of the occupations, the Giolitti government was very well aware that the armed proletariat had taken control of the factories and that the agricultural proletariat, under the impulse of its revolutionary offensive, was well on its way to taking possession of the land. It realized by accepting the battle before the counter-revolutionary forces were ready would be a big mistake. As the government prepared the reactionary forces destined one day to destroy the proletarian movement, they knew that they could utilize the maneuvering of the treacherous leaders of the General Federation of Labor, who were then members of the Socialist Party. By conceding the law on workers' control, which had never been voted on, let alone applied, the government was able to save the bourgeois state. The proletariat had seized the workshops and the landed estates, but the Socialist Party once again failed to secure united action by the industrial and agricultural workers. It is precisely this inability to secure united action which enabled the master class to achieve counter-revolutionary unity, and so defeat on the one hand the industrial workers and on the other the industrial agricultural workers. As we can see, the state has played the leading role in the development of the fascist movement. Okay, so let's see. All right, so the party must unify the industrial and agricultural workers, or else, or it will have breaks in it that the bourgeoisie can take advantage of. These are the partial interests versus the long-term general interests. Okay, back to text. After the Nidi, Giolitti, and Bonomi governments, there came de facto cabinet. Its job was to disguise the fact that fascism had been allowed complete freedom of action during its territorial advance. During the strike on August 22nd, 1922, bitter struggles erupted between the workers and the fascisti, with the latter openly supported by the government. We can cite the example of Bari, where the workers remained undefeated after an entire week of fighting and were barricaded inside their houses within the old city. They put up an armed defense, despite the full deployment of fascist forces. The fascisti had to beat a retreat, leaving several casualties behind. And what did the facto government do? During the night, they had the whole town surrounded with thousands of soldiers, hundreds of carabinieri and royal guards, and ordered a siege. From the harbor, a torpedo boat shelled the houses. Machine guns, armored cars, and rifles went into action. The workers, surprised in their sleep, were defeated. The Camera del Lavoro, the Chamber of Labor, was occupied. It was the same throughout the country. Wherever fascism had been beaten back by the workers, the power of the state intervened. Workers who resisted were shot down. Workers who were guilty of nothing but self-defense were arrested and sentences, whereas fascists, who were generally known to have committed innumerable crimes, were systematically acquitted by the magistrates. Thus, the state is the primary factor. The second factor in the development of fascism is, as already mentioned, the big bourgeoisie. The capitals of industry, finance, and commerce, and also the large landed proprietors, had obvious interest in the formation of a combative organization which support their attack on the workers. But the third factor played no less important role in the genesis of fascist power. In order to form a legal reactionary organization alongside the state, one has to recruit elements other than those belonging to the highest echelons of the dominant class. Such elements are obtained by turning to those sections of the middle class we've already mentioned, and by endeavoring to forge alliances with them by defending their interests. This is what fascism tries to do, and, let's admit, succeeds in doing. They recruit from the strata closest to the proletariat, from among those suffering the effects of the war, from the bas bourgeois, the semi-bourgeois, shopkeepers and tradesmen, and above all from intellectual elements amongst the bourgeois youth, who in adhering to fascism found the strength to morally redeem themselves, and dressed in toga, quote, quote, of struggle against the proletariat would end up subscribing to most fanatical patriotism and imperialism, the latter elements flocking to fascism in considerable numbers, which would allow it to organize militarily. I'm just going to put this in the text because this is, and these are the Ben Shapiro. These are Ben Shapiro types. These are the what do you call it? Jordan Peterson kids who are brought into this shit. This is exactly the kind of people that Gamergate focused on bringing into its number. Continuing. These are the three factors which have allowed our adversaries to confront us with a movement which is unequaled in its ferocity and brutality, but which, nevertheless, we need to recognize this, is well organized and has highly capable political leaders. The Socialist Party has never understood the significance of nascent fascism. Avanti never understood what the bourgeoisie was planning or how the criminal errors of the working class leaders would assist those plans. They didn't even like mentioning Mussolini's name in case it gave him publicity. As we can see, fascism is not a new political doctrine. It does, however, have a strong political and military organization and has a considerable press conducted with a good deal of journalistic flair and eclecticism. It has no ideas and no program. But now that it has arrived at the helm of the state and finds itself confronted by concrete problems, it is forced to concern itself with organizing the Italian economy. And from the passage from negative to positive activities, despite the strength of their organization, they will show their weakness. The fascist program. We have examined the historical and social factors influencing the birth of the fascist movement. We shall now discuss the fascist ideology and the program used to draw its various adherents towards it. Our critique leads us to the conclusion that fascism has added nothing new to the ideology and traditional program of bourgeois politics. Its superiority and originality consist in its organization, its discipline, and its hierarchy. But despite its exceptional military capabilities, fascism is still left with a thorny problem it can't resolve. Whilst economic crisis keeps the reasons for a revolutionary upsurge continually to the fore, fascism is incapable of reorganizing the bourgeois economic machine. Fascism will never be able to overcome the economic anarchy of the capitalist system, as another historical task which we may define as a struggle against political anarchy, against the anarchy of the bourgeois class organization as a political party. The different strata of the Italian ruling class may have always formed political and parliamentary groups which aren't based on soundly organized parties and which have fought amongst themselves. Under the leadership of career politicians, the competition between these groups around private and local interests has led to all kinds of intrigues in the corridors of parliament. The counter-revolutionary offensive has forced the ruling class, in the realms of the social struggle and government policy, to unify its forces. Fascism is a realization of this. Placing itself above all the traditional bourgeois parties, it is gradually sapping them of their membership, replacing them in their functions, and, thanks to the mistakes of the proletarian movement, managed to exploit the political power and human material of the middle classes, but will never manage to equip itself with a practical ideology and a program of social and administrative reforms, which goes beyond traditional bourgeois politics, a politics which had come to naught 1,000 times before. So what's being said here is that essentially fascism goes in and rather than allowing the continued parliamentary democracy that bourgeois democracy is, that bourgeois society is fond of for a variety of reasons. It's very efficient for dealing with internal strife between the bourgeoisie. It allows for essentially the spectacle of democracy to occur when in reality it's only the democracy of the bourgeoisie, it's not the democracy of the working class. There are many, many reasons for that. But under stress, under deep conditions, eventually the bourgeoisie are like, hey, look, if we don't all get together and suborn our individual partial interests to the interests of maintaining our shared individual class interest, which is the maintaining of private property, then all of us will lose. So they put together this organization that says neither left nor right, forward, class collaboration, everybody aiming for the same thing, including all members of the bourgeoisie, whether they like it or not, and all members of the proletariat, and everybody who resists this gets the boot. And yes, that involves some members of the bourgeoisie. And in fact, and especially with fascism, it comes from extreme reactionary backgrounds, so that also tends to include various things like anti-Semitism, which tends to be based, on killing a portion of your ruling class in order to offset blame over to them. Remember the subordination of individual interests to the interests of retaining private property as a whole, the same that communists wish to subordinate individual interests to the interest of the whole in terms of causing a revolution which will create a dictatorship of the proletariat. I found it sounds a little dirty putting it in the same vein, but still. Anyway, continuing. The critical part of fascist doctrine has no great value. It is anti-socialist and at the same time anti-democratic. As far as anti-socialism is concerned, it's clear that fascism is a movement of the anti-democratic forces. It is therefore natural that it should declare itself against all socialistic and semi-socialistic tendencies. It is unable, however, to present any new justification of the system of private ownership and seems happy to trot out the tired and old cliche about the failure of communism in Russia. As for democracy, it is supposed to make way for the fascist state because it failed to combat the revolutionary and anti-national tendencies. But that is just an empty phrase. Fascism is not a tendency of the right-wing bourgeoisie, which, basing itself on the aristocrats, the clergy, and the high civil and military functionaries, wants to replace the democracy of a constitutional monarchy by a monarchic despotism. This is different nowadays. In reality, fascism conducts its counter-revolutionary struggle by means of an alliance of all components of the bourgeoisie, and for this reason it is not absolutely necessary for it to destroy democratic institutions. From a Marxian point of view, this fact need by no means be considered paradoxical, as you know well that the democratic system is nothing more than a scaffolding of false guarantees erected in order to hide the domination of the ruling class over the proletariat. Fascism uses both reactionary violence and those demagogic sophistries by which the liberal bourgeoisie has always deceived the proletariat, while assuring the supremacy of capitalist interests. When the fascisti moved from their so-called criticism of liberal democracy to formulating their positive conception, inspired by patriotic fanaticism and the conception of a historical mission of the people, they are basing it on a historical myth that is easily exposed by a genuine social critique of the country of sham victories called Italy. In their methods of influencing the mob, we see nothing more than an imitation of the classical posture of bourgeois democracy. When it is stated that all interests must be subordinated to higher national interests, this just means that the principle of collaboration of classes should be supported, whilst in practice it just means protecting bourgeois institutions against the revolutionary attacks of the proletariat. Thus has liberal democracy always proceeded. The original feature of fascism resides in organization of the bourgeois party of government. Political events in the chamber of the Italian parliament made it appear that the bourgeois state has plunged into a crisis so severe that one shove would be enough to bring it crashing down. In reality, it was just a crisis of the bourgeois governmental system, brought about by the impotence of the old political groupings and the traditional Italian political leaders, who have failed to conduct an effective counter-revolutionary struggle during an acute crisis. Fascism constructed an organ capable of taking on the role of head of the state machine. But when alongside their negative anti-proletarian campaign, the Fascisti tried to set out a positive program and concrete proposals for the reorganization of the economic life of the country, the administration of the state, all they can do is repeat the banal platitudes of democracy and social democracy. They provide us with no evidence of an original and coordinated program. For example, they have always said that the fascist program advocates a reduction of the state bureaucracy, which, starting with a reduction in the number of ministers, then proceeds to extend it into all branches of the administration. However, if it is true that Mussolini has renounced special railway carriages, usually lodge or premier, he has nevertheless increased the number of cabinet ministers and undersecretaries in order to create jobs for his cronies. So this first part in particular is very, actually this entire thing is very familiar, right? The claims that, you know, Republicans or Democrats, if they get elected, it's the end of the country. And you have to pick a side or else it's the end of the country. This is the most important election of your lifetime, over and over and over again. Every single election is the most important election of your lifetime. But then it turns out that they all have the exact same platforms, ultimately, at least in concrete terms. It's, the Democrats and the Republicans are basically the exact same once you get down to it. And then you get somebody like Donald Trump who gets up, who's an embarrassment, and threatens how good American democracy looks without even actually combating it, really. He's like, oh, we'll drain the swamp. Did he drain the swamp? No. He increased it significantly, right? So it's all the same thing. So it's like, okay, was there really change? Kind of, yeah. You've got these fascist paramilitaries going on around and killing people on the streets and getting slaps on the wrist and stuff because the state is in cahoots with them. But the state was pretty much doing that already, just through less overt means. So yeah, there's a difference, but at the same time, it's aiming for the exact same shit. Um, and that's why I had my where's that? Then all right, found it. So here you go, liberal democracy, capitalism is threatened, and there's a reaction. There's a strong proletariat. Social democratic reforms can be pushed. And potentially this leads to the collapse of any serious organization because the bourgeois state bent, because it didn't fully push over to actual revolution. And from there, imperialism and various other things make it possible for this capitalism being threatened to just go away. And eventually, you get bourgeois ideology, reforms are abolished, and you're back to square one from social democracy. On the other hand, let's say you had a weak proletariat or a failed revolution, and more specifically, just a failed revolution. The weak proletariat is part and parcel to that, but usually, if you've got a weak proletariat, the state just crushes it before it ever starts, or the state crushes it alongside fascists, and then the fascists are weak enough that the state can liquidate them afterwards. The bourgeoisie support the reactionaries. Labor organizations are destroyed. Then you get the fascist government and all the various things. Labor rights reverse, development of false consciousness as all the working class organizations are destroyed. Eventually exhausts itself and achieves its purpose. It's either defeated by capitalist states as it tries to expand, or abdicates, as has been the historical position of it. So this is essentially how social democracy and fascism are effectively the same. The programs and platforms are the same. They have the same goals and stuff. It's just that fascism is a lot more rude about it. Let's just put it like that. Obviously, there's a difference. Very, very, very obviously, there's a difference. But in terms of the class struggle, they are the same. Anyway, continuing. The original feature of fascism resides in its organization of the bourgeois. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Fascism, after temporarily flirting with republicanism, has rallied to the most strict and loyalist monarchism. After railing against parliamentary corruption, has now completely accepted conventional parliamentary procedure. Fascism, in short, has allowed so little inclination to embrace the tendencies of pure reaction that has left plenty of room for trade unionism. During the Rome Congress in 1921, where their attempts at formulating doctrines verged on the ridiculous, they had even tried to characterize fascist trade unionism as being predominantly a movement of the intellectual categories of workers. The lie to this self-proclaimed theoretical orientation has, however, been amply provided by harsh reality. Fascism, basing its trade union categories upon the use of physical violence and the, quote, closed shop, sanctioned by employers with the object of breaking up the revolutionary trade unions, has not managed to extend its power to those organizations where the technical specialization of labor is higher. Their methods have met with some success among agricultural workers and certain sections of skilled urban workers, the dock workers, for example, but not amongst the more advanced and intelligent sections of the proletariat. It hasn't even provided a new impulse to trade union organization of office workers and artisans. There's no real substance to fascist syndicalism. The program and ideology of fascism contains a confused mixture of bourgeois and pay bourgeois demands and ideas, and systematic use of violence against the proletariat does not prevent it from making use of the opportunist methods used by social democracy. This is shown in the stance of the Italian reformists whose politics, for a while, appeared to be dominated by anti-fascist principles and by the illusion that a bourgeois proletarian coalition government could be formed against the fascisti, but who today have rallied behind triumphant fascism. This convergence is not all paradoxical. It is derived from a particular set of circumstances, and many things rendered it highly predictable. By the way, this is exactly what happened in Germany, too. The Social Democrats, the SPD, were completely in line with the Nazis, and they were part of the government bureaucracy after Nazis came to power, and they support them full hilt. For instance, there's the D'Annunzio movement, which on one hand is linked to fascism, but on the other endeavors to appeal to working class organizations on the basis of a program, deriving from the Fume Constitution, which claims to be both based on proletarian and even socialist foundations. Recent events. I would have liked to cover other important points regarding the fascist phenomena, but I'm running out of time. When the report is discussed, other Italian comrades will be able to fill in the gaps. I've intentionally omitted the sentimental side of the question and not referred to the sufferings experienced by the Italian workers and communists because I didn't feel as it was an essential aspect of the question. I must now turn to the recent events in Italy, a subject about which the Congress expects to be thoroughly informed. Our delegation left Italy before the recent events took place, and up to now, it's not received proper information about them. Last night, a comrade delegated by the Central Committee arrived here and gave us the necessary information. I vouch for the bona fide character of the news which we have received, and I will put it before you. The facto government, as mentioned earlier, enabled the fascists to carry out their policy on a very large scale. I will give just one example of this. It is a fact that the Catholic peasant Italian Popular Army, which was strongly represented in the successive string of governments around this time, didn't prevent the fascists from continuing their campaign against said party's organizations, members, and institutions. The existing government was merely a sham government whose sole activity consisted in supporting the fascist offensive in its bid to take power, an offensive which we have defined as purely territorial and geographical. In fact, the government was preparing the grounds for the fascist coup. However, the situation was changing fast. Another ministerial crisis arose. There were calls for Facta's resignation. The previous elections had brought about a situation in Parliament which had made it impossible to secure working majority using the old methods of the traditional bourgeois parties. In Italy, we were accustomed to saying that, quote, powerful liberal party was in power, but in fact it was not a party in the true sense of the word. It never existed as an actual party. It had no party organization. It was really just a conglomeration of personal cliques grouped around popular politicians in the North and South and around factions of the industrial and agricultural bourgeoisie, which were maneuvered by professional politicians. This loose ensemble of parliamentarians was in fact formed the kernel of every parliamentary combination. Fascism has reached a point where it had to choose between putting an end to this situation or else experience a very serious internal crisis. The question of organization also had to be considered. Means had to be found to provide for the needs of the fascist movement and keep it financially viable. These means were to a great extent provided by an employing class, and so appears also by foreign governments. France has given money to the Mussolini Group. At a secret session of the French government, a budget was discussed which included considerable sums of money handed over to Mussolini in 1915. By the way, it also turns out that the British government gave like £50,000 to him, among other things. Evidence of this in similar documents came to the notice of the Socialist Party, but they failed to do anything about it because they decided that Mussolini was already done for. The Italian government has also facilitated the task of the Fascisti by, for example, allowing its troops to use the railways free of charge. Nevertheless, if its leaders had decided not to take power, given the enormous expenses incurred by the fascist movement, they would have been in a very difficult situation. They couldn't afford to wait until the next elections in spite of the certainty of success. The fascists already have a strong political organization. Already they have 300,000 members, although they would say that is a low estimate. They could have even won just using democratic means. However, they were obliged to accelerate the process, and accelerate they did. On October 24th, a National Fascist Council was held in Naples. We now know that this event, which is actively publicized by the bourgeois press, was merely a maneuver to divert attention away from the coup d'etat. At a given moment, the members of Congress were told, quote, cut short your debates. There are more important things to do. Every man to his post. End quote. The fascist mobilization was underway. It was October 26th. All was quiet in the capital. Facta had declared his determination not to resign, or not at least until he had called a cabinet meeting in line with normal procedure. Nevertheless, in spite of this declaration, he would hand in his resignation to the king. Negotiations got underway to form a new government. The fascists began their march on Rome, the center of their activity. They were particularly active in central Italy, especially in Tuscany. They were left to get on with it. Solander was charged with the forming of a new government, but it declined due to the attitude of the fascists. If at this stage the job hadn't been entrusted to Mussolini, the fascists may well have taken to banditry and gone on a destructive rampage through towns and rural districts, even if against the wishes of their leaders. Public opinion started to show signs of disquiet. The Facta government then threatened to declare martial law. Martial law was duly declared. For an entire day, there was an expectation of a collision between the forces of the state and the fascist forces. Our comrades remained very skeptical about such a possibility. In reality, the fascists did not meet with any serious resistance anywhere. And yet certain sectors of the army were inimical to the fascists. The soldiers were ready to fight them. The majority of the officers, however, were pro-fascist. The king refused to sign the declaration of martial law. This would have been tantamount to accepting the conditions of the fascists, which had been set out in the Popolo d'Italia as follows, quote, in order to obtain illegal solutions, it is only necessary to ask Mussolini to form a new cabinet. If this is not done, we shall march on Rome, end quote. A few hours after the revoking of the declaration of martial law, it is known that Mussolini was on his way to Rome. A military defense of the city had already got ready. Troops had been concentrated in the area. But by now, the negotiations were already over. On October 31st, the fascists entered Rome without a shot being fired. Mussolini then formed a new government, the composition of which you already know. Although the Fascist Party only had 35 seats in parliament, it had an absolute majority in the government. Mussolini reserved for himself the position of president of the council, the portfolios of the Ministry of the Interior and of Foreign Affairs. Other important portfolios were divided among the members of the Fascist Party. But, since a complete break with the traditional parties had not yet occurred, the government included 2 representatives of social democracy, that is, of the bourgeois left, as well as some of the right-wing liberals and one of Giolidi's supporters. Representing the monarchy, we find General Diaz at the Ministry of War, and Admiral Thaon de Revel at the Admiralty. The Popular Party, which carries a lot of weight in the chamber, has shown its readiness to compromise with Mussolini. Under the pretext that the official organs of this party could not meet in Rome, the responsibility for accepting Mussolini's offers were deputed to an unofficial assembly composed of some of the party's parliamentarians. A few concessions were wrung from Mussolini, and the press of the Popular Party was able to announce that the new government hadn't really changed the way by which the people were represented through the electoral system. The compromise was even extended to the Social Democrats. At one point, it was thought that Baldessi, the reformist socialist, would also join the cabinet. With considerable astuteness, Mussolini approached him by one of his lieutenants, and after Baldessi had declared he would be happy to accept the post, Mussolini represented the whole affair as a personal démarche by one of his friends, at which point Baldessi decided not to enter the cabinet after all. And Mussolini doesn't have any representatives of the former reformist Confederazione Generale del Lavoro in the government. It is principally because right-wing elements in the cabinet are opposed to it. But now that the CGL has become independent of any revolutionary party, he still thinks it is necessary to have one of its representatives in his, quote, Grand National Coalition. In these events, we can see a compromise between the traditional political cliques and the various sections of the ruling class. For example, the landed proprietors and the financial and industrial capitalists. And all of these have rallied to the new state regime by a movement receiving strong support from the pays bourgeois. As far as we are concerned, fascism is a way of retaining power by using all means at the disposal of the ruling class, including even the utilization of the lessons of the first victorious proletarian revolution, the Russian Revolution. Faced with a severe economic crisis, power cannot be maintained by the forces of the state alone. There must also be a united party, a centralized counter-revolutionary organization. The Fascist Party, in relation to the bourgeoisie, is somewhat like the Russian Communist Party in relation to the proletariat, an organ for the direction and control of the state machine which is solidly organized and disciplined. The Fascist Party in Italy has placed its political agents inside every important branch of the state. It is a bourgeois organ for the control of the state during the period of capitalist decadence. This is, in my opinion, an adequate historical interpretation of fascism and the recent events in Italy. I want to remind you that he's not saying that the Russian Revolution was fascist. He is saying that it is learning from the struggle there, and it's learning that in order to maintain power, it needs to centralize control. It needs to, to effectively fight against the revolution. It needs to centralize control, and it needs to subordinate all partial class interests to the general long-term class interests of the particular class. So it's similar in that sense, but these are two fundamentally different things, and as you might be able to guess, the subordination of the proletariat to their own class interests is fundamentally different than the subordination of the industrial agriculture, the industrial bourgeoisie, the financiers, and all of that to the same group. Okay, continuing. The first measures of the new government show that no fundamental changes are going to be made to the traditional institutions. I do not mean, of course, that the present situation favors the proletarian socialist movement, and I do predict that fascism will end up as liberal and democratic. All that the working class has ever received from democratic governments are proclamations and promises. For example, the Mussolini government has assured us that it will respect the liberty of the press. It has been careful to add, though, that the press must be deserving of such liberty. What does this mean? It means that despite the government promising to respect the liberty of the press, it will allow its militaristic fascist organizations, if they feel so inclined, to gag the communist newspapers. Indeed, there have already been a few cases of this happening. Conversely, we must recognize that although the fascist government has made some concessions to bourgeois liberals, we cannot pin much hope on Mussolini's assurance that he will transform his military organization into athletic associations or something similar. We've heard about dozens of fascists being arrested because they refused to obey the demobilization order issued by Mussolini. What has been the effect of these events upon the proletariat? It has found itself in the position of playing no important role in the struggle, and has had to behave in an almost passive manner. So far as the Communist Party is concerned, it has always known that the victory of fascism equates with the defeat of the revolutionary movement. Since today is an indisputable fact that we are incapable of launching an actual offensive against the fascist reaction, the essential question is whether the tactics of the Communist Party have managed to derive the maximum possible gains from a defensive vantage point as far as the defense of the Italian proletariat is concerned. If, instead of a compromise between the bourgeoisie and the fascisti, there had been a military conflict, a civil war, the proletariat might have been able to play a certain role by creating a united front for the general strike and scoring some successes. But as matters stood, the proletariat wasn't able to take part in the action. However important recent events might be, one mustn't lose sight of the fact that the change in the political scene has been much less sudden than might appear. There had been a daily accumulation of events leading up to the final coup of the Fascisti. As an example of the battle between the state and the Fascisti, it suffices to mention the clash in Cremona, during which there were 6 casualties. The workers fought only in Rome, where the revolutionary working class forces clashed with the Fascisti and many were wounded. The next day, the Royal Guard occupied the working class quarters and deprived it of all means of defense, and thus made it possible for the Fascisti to go in and shoot down the workers in cold blood. Amongst recent struggles in Italy, this has been the most bloody. When the Communist Party proposed a general strike, the Confederación del General de Livorno disarmed the proletariat by urging them not to follow the dangerous exhortations of the revolutionary groups. At the very moment when our press was prevented from appearing, they spread the rumor that the Communist Party had been dissolved. The most damaging incident involving our party in Rome was the invasion by the Fascisti and the editorial offices of Il Comunista. On the 31st October, when the city was occupied by 100,000 Fascisti, the printing plant was entered by a band of Fascisti just as the paper was coming out. All staff were able to evade the Fascisti by leaving through emergency exits with the exception of Comrade Togliatti, our editor-in-chief, who was in his office. The Fascisti entered and seized him. Boldly, he declared that he was chief editor of Il Comunista, and he was stood up against the wall to be shot. As the Fascisti pushed back the crowd in preparation for his execution, they were informed that the other editors were escaping over the roofs. Only when the aggressors set off in pursuit was our comrade able to make his escape. Not that this prevented our comrade, only a few days later, from speaking at me in turn to celebrate the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. But this is an isolated case. The organization of our party is in pretty good shape. If the publication of Il Comunista is suspended, it is not because of a governmental order, but because the printers refuse to publish it. We published it illegally in another printing plant. The difficulties in publishing it were not technical in nature, but economic. The building of the Ordine Nuovo in Turin has been seized and arms kept on the premises for its defense have been confiscated, but the paper is now being published elsewhere. In Trieste, the police invaded the printing plant of our paper Il Lavoratore, but this paper is appearing illegally as well. The possibilities of legal work still exist for our party, and our situation is not that tragic. Yes, it is. but it's difficult to foresee future development, and it is for this reason that I must express myself in a slightly guarded way with regard to the future situation of our party and progress of our work. The comrade who has just arrived is in charge of an important local organization of our party, and he expresses the interesting opinion, which is shared by many militants, that it is easier to work now than previously. I do not want to present this opinion as an established fact, but the comrade who voiced it is a militant working among the masses, and his view is not to be taken lightly. I have already told you that the opposition press spread the false news our party had been dissolved. We have denied this and reestablished the truth. Our Central Party organs, our illegal military center, our trade union center are working flat out, and our links with the rural districts have been almost completely reestablished. Our comrades in Italy did not for a single moment lose their heads and are now making all necessary arrangements. As for socialists, the Avanti offices were destroyed by the Fascisti and will be for some time before the paper comes out again. The headquarters of the Socialist Party in Rome, along with its archives, were completely destroyed by fire. With regards to the stance of the Maximalists in the polemic between the Communist Party and the Confederation General de Livorno, we have no statement or document whatsoever. As far as the reforms are concerned, it is clear from the tone of their publications, which continues to be published, that they will ally themselves with the new government, of course. Regarding the trade union situation, Comrade Raposi of our trade union committee thinks it will be possible for this work to continue. This is the latest information we have received as of November 6th. I've already talked for quite a while, and I won't touch upon the question of the stance our party has taken over the whole period of development of fascism, whilst I reserve my right to do so at some other stage in the Congress. With regard to prospects for the future, we believe that fascism will have to come face to face with the discontent provoked by its governmental policies. But as we know only too well, when one controls not only the state but also military organization too, it is a lot easier to suppress manifestations of discontent and master unfavorable economic conditions. This factor is also extremely decisive in the case of the dictatorship of the proletariat, when historical developments are in our favor. Undoubtedly, the fascisti are very well organized and will have set themselves clear objectives. Under these circumstances, one may conclude that the position of the fascist government is by no means insecure. You may have noted that I have not exaggerated the conditions under which our party has been conducting its struggle. That is because I wish to avoid turning it into a sentimental issue. Perhaps the Communist Party of Italy has committed certain errors. We are entitled to criticize these, but I believe, at the present time, that the attitude of our comrades is proof that we have carried out an important task: the formation of a revolutionary party of the proletariat, basis for the recovery of the working class in Italy. Italian communists have a right to be recognized for who they are. Even if their approach hasn't always met with approval, they feel as if they have nothing to reproach themselves with before the revolutionary movement and the Communist International. And that is the text of Bordiga's report on fascism. There wasn't actually anything in particular we learned extra, or at least I learned extra. Maybe some more of you learned some stuff. But I hope that you all enjoyed that text. And that is the end of this recording.